I've done many Terraria challenges over the years, and every now and then I'll receive comments like this, telling me to just play the game normally. And you know what? I think it's finally time I take them up on this offer. So, I'd like you all to meet Norman, a perfectly average guy who's going to journey his way through Terraria without any challenges or restrictions. Just normal Terraria gameplay. And it doesn't get any more normal than playing in classic mode. Nearly every Terraria playthrough starts by chopping down some trees for wood and building some houses for your NPCs. So I got to work on a standard house. Now, for those of you thinking there's no way this is a suitable housing design, you'd be right, because I was forgetting a torch. After making a couple more equally normal houses, I explored the surface to find a desert pyramid and found these two small looking puddles in the tundra. So, for no particular reason, I started roping up and, hey, there's a floating island here. Now that we have this Star Fury, we're ready for the first boss. Well, after building our arena, of course. I built a very standard dirt box, placed a few floating blocks in the middle, and hammered them like so. Then I carved a small chamber below the box to stand in, and with that, we were ready for your average King Slime fight. As I'm sure you all know, when given the choice between attacking a player and taking a trip on this Hoik ride, King Slime will almost always choose the latter. Though, he does get a little shy when he gets to about half health, so you need to give him some space. But after taking care of King Slime, I noticed that the Demolitionist had moved in, which means we can buy the explosives necessary for taking on the second boss in the game, Skeletron. So, we're just going to throw a few dynamite up here, a few down here, and finally a few inside the dungeon itself. Now, I seem to have missed some of my throws because he was supposed to die there, so it's a good thing we brought some grenades. Inside the dungeon, we find the Mechanic, Cobalt Shield, Bewitching Table, Alchemy Table, and most importantly, a Shadow Key, which will come in handy later on. With the bones that I obtained in the dungeon, I was able to craft the Necro Armor, and now that we had defeated Skeletron, the Dryad was able to move in. Which is great news for us because I needed to get some pumpkins growing as soon as possible before I could take on the Eater of Worlds. While waiting for those pumpkins to grow, I summoned in the Eye of Cthulhu, which may have been a bit early for a normal playthrough, but with some careful play, I managed to get by. In addition to pumpkins, I also needed access to the Aether biome for the Eater of Worlds fight, and the quickest way to locate it is of course to figure out what your guide's name is. In this case, it's Kyle, so if we dig down in precisely this spot, we'll find our Aether, and also a huge Dragon Egg, which is a nice bonus as well. We're still waiting on those pumpkins though, so I switched my focus to Deerclops next. To pair with the Ranger armor, I decided to go with the best Ranger weapon available to us, the Flare Gun. After finding the Deerclops summon in a frozen chest, I bought 999 flares from the merchant, and spent the next 5 minutes shooting the flares into the ground. No matter how hard Deerclops may try, the sheer intimidation factor of the nearby 999 flares prevents him from conjuring up his usual ice or shadow magic. Even our Star Fury was having some performance anxiety, as none of the stars were raining down. Fortunately, the sword itself still works, and because the player doesn't take any contact damage from Deerclops' legs, we can just sit here and swing our sword until it goes down. And by this point, our pumpkins were ready, so I started building an Eater of Worlds arena, something I usually skip in my challenge runs. I built a stone platform, roped to the top of the corruption biome to set up a bed spawn, and made a small wooden box just below it. Now, for those of you wondering why we need pumpkins for the Eater of Worlds, I don't blame you. It's been a while since I've fought this boss normally too. But pumpkins can shimmer into cactus, and cactus can be crafted into cactus boulders through the heavy workbench, provided you're in a graveyard biome. With the cactus boulders secured, I set a stick of dynamite on one of these shadow orbs, and magic mirrored to force the Eater to spawn in our arena. Then, all we have to do is grapple to the top of this box, which will automatically trigger the boulders as we place them down. And just like that, we've defeated the Eater of Worlds. Afterwards, the goblins decide to invade, which means we'll get access to Reforges soon. However, all of these pylons have really done a number on our gold supply, so I decided to get that sorted before defeating the event. Of course, the most efficient and normal way to make money in this game is to scam the NPCs. First, I moved the merchant, nurse, and dye trader to the Aether biome. Then I bought torches and anvils from the merchant, and egg blocks from the dye trader. From there, we can shimmer the anvils for iron, which we can then use to craft chains, and using these 3 ingredients, we can craft egg chandeliers, and sell them right back to the merchant for profit. If you're wondering where the nurse comes in, she's just here to put the merchant in a good mood so we can get better deals from him. Simply repeat this process over and over, and before you know it, you'll have a perfectly normal amount of platinum coins. With that, I could now defeat the goblins and purchase nearly 400 dynamite to put towards our elevator. While I unfortunately wasn't able to find the goblin tinker on the way down, I did find plenty of life crystals and, more importantly, this penguin statue, which will be instrumental to our normal playthrough endeavors. The mage class felt to be pretty standard for this part of the game, so I decided to work on swapping over to it. Down in hell, there are 3 potential mage weapons. However, These two are of course the ones everybody goes for. To go along with these mage weapons, I wanted to get some jungle armor, so I spent some time looting spores, stingers, and vines, and while doing so, found the nature's gifts, Goblin Tinkerer, and the last 2 life crystals we needed to reach 400 life. From there, I reforged all of our items and started preparing for the Queen Bee fight. In order to fight this boss the intended way, we'll need to take advantage of Shimmer. While I could just lure the boss over here, things would be much more convenient if we had access to Shimmer right by a beehive. Unfortunately, the game doesn't want the player to have the ability to move the Shimmer because you can't pick it up with the bucket. But the good news is, if you have the mechanic, you can simply buy a couple pumps and transport it to wherever you like. As I'm sure most of you know, projectiles will bounce back up after interacting with the Shimmer. While that may seem insignificant to a weapon like the Flower Fire, which can already bounce projectiles off of blocks, the difference here is that because it never actually touches any blocks, the fireballs won't actually disappear like they normally would after 5 bounces. So we can stack up a very reasonable amount of fireballs before summoning Queen Bee. And with that, just one boss remained. Of course, before we can take on the Wall of Flesh, we need to build our arena. So again, I built the usual Wall of Flesh dirt box and enclosed 2 teleporters halfway up the walls, making sure to leave a couple blocks open in the center. Inside one of these enclosures, we can spawn in an enemy using just about any statue. Then, by activating this timer, said enemy will start rapidly teleporting back and forth. Thanks to that gap in the teleporter rooms, our Flame Lash projectile has line of sight and will attempt to track the enemy. However, because it's teleporting so fast, it will never be able to reach it. Therefore, we can once again stack as many of these projectiles as we want. And I figured once my game started dropping frames, we were ready. Once in hard mode, I destroyed some altars, mined out the hard mode ores for new armor, farmed up fairy dust for some wings, and built this AFK farm so I could collect Souls of Night. These Souls of Night can then be crafted into Keys of Night to summon corruption mimics, which, with any luck, will drop us the Clinger Staff. These mimics can be rather aggressive though, so we need to build a cage for them first. I made a 5x5 box, put a platform in the middle, and hammered one side down. Then all you have to do is place down the chest, summon the mimic, and hammer the other side down. At this point, as long as you stand directly underneath the platform in the center, the mimic will be trapped here forever, and you can get your loot without getting any nasty bites. With that, it was time to build our Queen Slime arena. Unfortunately, there's no way the same arena we used for King Slime will work on this boss, because it's not in the Hallowed biome, so I quickly built the same thing over there, but with lava this time to speed up the fight. The next boss up is the Destroyer, and I'd say it usually takes about 4 seconds to deplete its health bar. To hit that quota, I first looted a magic conch in the underground desert, then I roped up above the ocean and built 3 houses. By moving in some NPCs, this will become a town which will prevent enemy spawns, which is important because we don't want any wyverns spawning in while we're fighting the boss. Next, I crafted a star cannon, and after looting about 60 fallen stars, I summoned the boss in, conched to our town, lined up the cursor with the boss icon on the map, and started blasting. Using the hallowed bar as a drop from Destroyer, I crafted the hallowed repeater, but before taking on the other mechs, I wanted to grab 2 more items. First was the Blessed Apple, which took about 10 minutes to farm on our hallowed enemy farm, and second, the Bloody Tear. So I slept for about 15 minutes until we had a Blood Moon spawn, and farmed enemies until I got it to drop. We're going to start off with Skeletron Prime. In order to spawn him, we need a bunch of penguins. Unfortunately, this statue that we picked up earlier only spawns 6 of them, but that's where the Blood Moon comes in. Because these statues spawn penguins instantly turn into their world eagle counterparts during Blood Moon, the game never reaches a statue critter spawn cap, and thus will continue to spit these guys out. Once the statue stops spawning enemies, we can kill exactly 1 enemy to free up a slot to spawn Skeletron Prime. I wonder why they decided to remove this guy's limbs for the mechanical version. Weird design choice. For the twins, I built a long dirt platform and used the unicorn mount to run away because they're much too slow to keep up. Once Spasmatism went down and Retinazer reached phase 2, it was time to build a box around the player. Because while Retinazer generally gets stronger in phase 2, it also loses object permanence. So despite watching Norman build around himself, Retinazer isn't quite sure where he went. So, after a quick game of peekaboo, I was able to craft a full hallowed armor set and a jousting lance before heading to the hard mode jungle. In preparation for Plantera, I grabbed 2 teleporters, 2 pressured minecart tracks, some normal minecart tracks, and some wire. After finding a bulb, I placed down 1 teleporter and built a minecart track above it, placing the pressured minecart track in the middle. Then I hammered the teleporter, and the end of the track track so I could bounce back and forth. From there, I built the same thing above it, connected it with some wire, and placed a few blocks between them. Then, all you have to do is spawn in the boss, bait it to the middle of the teleporters, and with the jousting lance and a healthy dose of skill, take her down. For one of the upcoming bosses, I needed to grind out some defender medals from the Old One's Army event. To fight this event, we need 3 things: an Eternia Crystal, a Summoning Altar, and 2 regular platforms. While there were many close calls, I managed to just barely farm out 60 defender medals. Though, we're not going to spend them just yet, because I specifically was after the tier 3 sentry staff, which only becomes available after defeating Golem. So I made my way to the temple. However, I heard the lizards usually keep the front door locked, so I decided to sneak my way in the back. As we all know, Golem is the hardest boss in the game, and the only way to subdue him is to bring out the penguin statue. Even in this state, we couldn't let her guard down, because just one wrong move and her fate will be sealed. Now that we've passed that grueling test of strength, we can grab our weapon of choice for Empress, the explosive trap staff. For those of you that have never fought this boss the intended way before, you need to stack up many of these explosive trap sentries on top of one another. Under normal circumstances, you can only place down a handful of these sentries outside of the event, and the only way to get more is to trigger the event and use Ethereal mana. However, we're going to need much more mana than what you can get during the event, and any mana that is left in your inventory automatically gets discarded when the event ends. However, that same check only applies to chests when you access them. So we can start the event, place the mana in the chest, quit out, then rinse and repeat. And after a blazingly quick 20-minute menuing session, we had over 3,000 mana at our disposal. However, we still had one problem to overcome. In order to fully utilize all 300 plus sentries, we have to stack them on top of each other. Annoyingly, the game doesn't let you do this, or at least not without a little extra work. If we rig up this dirt block to a timer, we can rapidly actuate it over and over. When the block is actuated, the sentry will fall down, leaving space for a new sentry to spawn in right on top of it. But before we go get that mana, it is crucial that we start the Old One's Army event, because if not, as soon as we open that chest, all of our mana will disappear. Now, as I spawn these sentries in, I should probably issue a volume warning, because you're about to hear over 300 sentry blasts detonate in unison. Without further ado, here is Daytime Empress of Light. And one more for good measure. For Duke Fishron, I farmed out the chain gun and set up 2 teleporters in the air with hammered platforms on the walls facing each other. Then I placed a wall of blocks in the middle and summoned the boss. Very few people fight this boss the intended way, because this requires very precise, near frame perfect teleport timings to get it right. Oh, and if you're building this yourself, make sure to place these teleporters even further away, as my damage window was very small. As a result, this fight started to drag on, and I would eventually have to resort to a more cheesy method for this boss. So you'll have to forgive me. For Cultist, we brought out the flare gun once again because it's still the best weapon available. However, it is imperative that we use blue flares this time because they look much cooler. Once again, my other weapons seemed to sense how inferior they were to the flare gun, because aside from my summons, none of them seemed to work. Luckily, I was able to use my pickaxe to spawn in the boss, and thanks to some careful maneuvering, I was able to record another flawless no-hit. After an average run through the pillars, it was time to greet the final boss of the game. However, we're not going to fight him just yet. Instead, we're taking his measurements, because I couldn't quite remember the dimensions for the Moonlord arena. To deal with the hands, we're going to use the same Flame Lash strategy that we used against Wall of Flesh, except this time we're using a Rainbow Rod, and the teleporters are oriented vertically. After activating the teleporters, I spent a couple minutes building up rainbow projectiles on each side. Then, for the core and the top eye, we're going to use this structure here. While submerged in water with the inner tube equipped, you'll start floating up and gaining momentum, and as you hit these pressure plates, you'll be teleported back to the bottom, allowing for your speed to scale to intended levels. Then, using the Shadow Jousting Lance that I farmed up in the dungeon, we can transfer all of that speed into our damage. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure why I never hit the core here, as when I tested this out before making this video, it just died instantly, but I eventually just aimed my lance down, and we're good. While it was nice to play the game normally again, I think I'll stick to my challenge runs. Oh, and if you'd like to find out more about how to execute these normal strategies, there will be a ton of resources for you to check out in the description. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.